Welcome back to Odyssey of a Teenage Dirtbag, the true story of how a kid who once had nothing, no direction, and no shot built a life worth living. If you're new here, I'm glad you found us. If you like what you hear, I encourage you to go back and check out the story from the very first episode. This podcast is about what it really takes to climb out from rock bottom and why that's always possible. I'm your host, Michael. Let's get into it. This is episode 7, Homecoming. Landing back on solid ground in Washington was a hell of a feeling. I'd spent nearly a year out of the country, and just seeing the evergreen trees again warmed my heart. My family had picked me up from the airport, and I hugged them all deeply. My mom and dad were there, and my sisters came with them, and they all commented that I was super tan and that my hair was way long, but they were all just genuinely happy to see me. You know, these were my people. And on the way home to Bonnie Lake, there's always this moment when you come up Highway 410 along Eli Hill, right as you crest the top of the place where Sky Island Drive crosses the highway. And Mount Rainier just hits you smack in the center of the skyline and really rips the breath right out of your lungs. It's totally majestic. It was kind of my, we're not in Kansas anymore kind of feeling, you know, and it just had all set in all at once. I realized I was home. My friends threw me a few welcome home parties, and while I enjoyed the attention, I really felt like Robert De Niro's character in The Deer Hunter coming back from Vietnam. I was indifferent to the experience. In a sense, it felt like my entire life had changed, like I'd been gone a lifetime, like I'd been born and died and was born again. I wasn't the same person from before Mexico. I could speak 2 languages. I'd taught ESL. I'd made friends from all over the world. I'd learned guitar. I could skateboard better than ever before. But more importantly, my heart had changed. I was motivated to be better. I had a suitcase full of new dreams about what my future could hold, and I was ready to unpack them. So my entire life had changed. But it seemed like everyone around me was exactly like before I left them. Taylor and the whole crew who I'd been spending a majority of my time with before I'd left, they had all been raided at Taylor's apartment. Apparently, law enforcement had been conducting long-term investigation into activities there involving detectives and the whole works. And ultimately, they had crashed in and arrested everyone just a bit after I had left to Mexico. They were all in serious trouble and facing a handful of drug-related criminal charges. Jack and Noel, he had moved away and to join the army to avoid some of the serious consequences. But Taylor and a few others were swept up. And it really did seem like I dodged a bullet by going to Mexico when I did. A few weeks into returning, I had rekindled my connection with Madison. We started seeing each other again, and I think she was charmed by my new international man appeal. She was still sort of out of my league, so I was happy to have her affection and attention for a while. But I started taking a prescription for antidepressants because I had shared in honesty with my primary care provider when asked that I had some infrequent substance use. And he thought that it was a sign that I was dealing with depression or anxiety, and I was using those drugs as a way to self-medicate. And so he recommended I take a regimen of SSRIs to sort of cope with life. And I was naive, and I just wanted to do what the doctor ordered. So I took them, not really needing them, I guess. And these SSRIs really fucked with me. When I first started taking them, I would get these rapid shifts in mood. And God forbid if I forgot to take one for like more than one day, I was thrown into these like explosive rage episodes. It was all really out of character for me generally. So I tried to get off them before they really like ruined my life. Or at least I ruined my life all over again. But Madison and I, meanwhile, we didn't last too long. I don't think she was really ever that into me as much as she was into the idea of me. Like I always felt like I was convincing her to spend time with me. And she dated this other guy, Aaron, before me, and they remained in close contact. And I think her heart was sort of still there. Aaron had cheated on Madison with a friend of hers named Ashley. And Ashley and I were friends, and so She was actually the person who had introduced me to Madison, but there was this sort of lingering bitterness between Ashley and Madison from the Aaron situation. And so anyways, during a party that Madison wasn't able to attend, Ashley, myself, and another girl all fell asleep together in one of the bedrooms. Now, we didn't have any sex. We didn't do anything physical at all. We just all went to bed in the same place. Not that it made it right, but it made it better, maybe. But either way, Madison still found out and was not having any of it. She broke up with me, and, all's fair. But at the time, I didn't really care anyways. Plenty of fish in the sea was sort of my motto. And I was young, and the world was my oyster. I was just happy to move on and find someone else to take interest in me. And Madison never really seemed that interested in me anyways. And so I figured that relationship had an expiration date, even if I hadn't fucked things up. So anyways, I needed to find a job. I was still just a high school dropout with a criminal record. I had a GED now at this point, but no real marketable skills. So I was pretty open to whatever opportunities were available to me. Locally, there was a sort of mental hospital called Rainier School that employed much of the community on the plateau. It was like a sprawling campus that was originally built in the 30s, way out in the middle of nowhere to house the unmentionables of society. At the time, that included women experiencing hysteria, gays, the criminally insane, mentally ill, and just developmentally disabled adults and children. Later, they just housed mostly developmentally disabled adults with a range of co-occurring mental issues, but that was sort of the genesis of this whole mental health hospital facility out on the plateau. The whole base of operations at Rainier School used to be pretty expansive in its heyday, too. They had underground tunnels with entire road systems that ran beneath the surface, with space for jeeps to transport patients and medical staff from operating rooms to dormitories. They had ice bath tanks down there too, and whole wards and behavioral centers where they would perform frontal lobe lobotomies back in the day. It was like a place straight out of the movies. Anyways, my brother and his friend Seth had managed to get a job there working nights, and they'd convinced me that the pay was good, that working graveyard was easy, and that they mostly just had to fold clothes while they watched TV, and only occasionally, just occasionally, did something weird happen. But otherwise, it was easy money, and there was opportunity for advancement and overtime. And so they talked me into it. It all sounded pretty good to me. And at this point, I had a pretty illustrious career spanning, very prominent fields, from mowing lawns for a landscape company, to scooping ice cream for Baskin and Robbins, to flipping burgers at Wendy's, and spot welding and brake press operating for Red Dot, also teaching ESL for a nonprofit, and of course, selling drugs for petty cash. So I was ready for something that I could connect to a sense of direction and that gave me a long-term career potential. I knew that at Rainier School there was potential to work my way up the ranks and eventually make even as much as like $25 an hour if I was really lucky and broke my way into management. So that seemed like a pretty sweet gig, especially compared to the $50 a week I'd been making when living in Mexico. So when I filled out my application for hire at Rainier School, I had to put down like any prior criminal history, and I had to report, anything I'd done. And during the interview, I was interviewed with a panel of 3, and it went really well. So I was optimistic things might actually work out. But then I got this call that my background check had came back with a negative flag and that they needed to sit down and talk with me about it. So I met with the dean of campus, and he was some sort of, PhD type in a suit. If you opened up the encyclopedia and turned to the word professor, I bet it would have his picture in there. He had one of those Abraham Lincoln-style Amish kind of beards, that wrapped his chin, and he was wearing this tweed 3-piece suit when I met him. And overall, he was really a nice fellow. He asked me about my criminal charges and what had happened, and as well as, how I'd reflected on the experience and felt my behavior had changed. And I explained that I'd been to rehab, that I'd lived in Mexico and learned a lot about myself, and I was very much committed to the positive changes I made. He agreed to take me on and hire me, and I was ecstatic. My first week of work, though, I had a black eye. I hadn't fully committed to stopping my SSRIs, and so I'd been off them for a few days, and I was just going absolutely mad. I flew off the handle at every little thing, and at some point I picked a fist fight with my brother in the driveway of our house. And initially I was just making haymaker swings, and he was backing up, and nothing was connecting. Then out of nowhere, Seth, his friend, was behind me, grabbing my arms to sort of restrain me and break up the fight. But my brother was a total opportunist, and he looked at me with my hands behind my back, restrained by Seth, and decided to lay one right on my left eye. Now, I take full responsibility for starting the fight and, play stupid games, win stupid prizes, but I still think it was a cheap shit shot. And I wasn't happy that I had to go to work with a black eye for my first week on the job. Everyone asked me what had happened, and I just told them I was playing football and had collided with the opposing team. I didn't want to be dishonest, but I had only just landed the job, and reporting a fist fight seemed like a poor way to get off on the right foot. Everything started off okay, though, otherwise. I had 2 days of training, and then they sent us out to our house assignment for our first night of work. And the campus was set up by organizing client houses into groups along these various cul-de-sacs. And we called the patients clients, and they were most definitely patients, and they were residents at the facility involuntarily. But the client language was some sort of psychological conditioning intended to improve the outlook of the staff on the folks they served day to day. And so instead of calling them patients, we called them clients. And they would live in these groups of 5 on these houses. And with the houses being organized in PATs, depending on the client diagnosis and the care level. There were 3 primary PATs, A, B, and C, with A being the highest level of care, mostly bedridden folks, B requiring more of an intermediate patient care level, and C, who were higher functioning folks that still needed some level of care or supervision to prevent harm. I was assigned to PAT C, and my house had a handful of residents, none of whom were violent, but it did have a few runners and a few other clients with behavioral issues. And so I would assist with their daily care needs, and I would wear a pager for the BRT team, or behavior response team. And this meant that I would wear this pager while I was on my house assignment, and occasionally it would go off and list the specific location and incident type on the pager screen that I would have to respond to. And every time the pager went off, I would confirm the location and then run out into the night as the first responder to whatever behavioral incident was occurring. And I sort of always wanted to be the second responder, to be honest. But inevitably, most of the time, I would arrive on the scene alone, and there would always be some patient naked as the day they were born, with some other patient or staff member being violently assaulted, and I would have to jump in and intervene in this sweaty, bloody mess. Within a few months on the job, I'd been kicked, spit on, punched, ambushed, in and out of more wrestling matches than one lifetime deserves. In training, we learned special techniques that we were required to employ called nonviolent interventions, and they were essentially required us to use what they called puppy paws or open hand restraints. So you'd have to keep your hands like a paw, and we had to use that anytime we were maneuvering a client. You couldn't close your hand or close your hand around the client when you were wrestling them, and so it was difficult, obviously, whenever you were dealing with somebody violent, to try to maneuver them, out of that incident. oftentimes I would use a 3-person hold with the other members of the BRT team to restrain the client. And that involved one person holding down the client's leg on one side and another person holding down the client's leg on the other side. And then this other person wearing these like really supersized oven mitts and holding them on either side of the patient's head to prevent biting or spitting. Honestly, it was like always a crazy time sitting in those 3-person holds while the patient just went absolutely ape shit and us hoping they didn't break free from one or the other restraints while they, spit and attempted to bite us. Due to HIPAA regulations and other internal policy decisions, the nurses were not allowed to tell the other team members which patients had AIDS, hepatitis C, or any other type of bloodborne diseases. So oftentimes the patient would be bleeding or spitting all over you, and you really had no idea what your risk level was. A lot of policies sort of prioritize client safety over the safety of the staff, which resulted in this environment where you never really felt safe. And it fostered and nurtured kind of a strange us versus them mentality between many of the staff dealing with the higher risk patients just due to the nightly violence in some of the houses. Rumors long circulated of a staff member getting their face chewed off, or a different time a staff member was like ambushed and sexually assaulted by a handful of the patients. Being alone at night and traveling along the corridors to respond to an emergency just had this way of putting my skin on edge. It was eerie to say the least. But life went on and I settled into my job there. I was an AC1, so I thought that if I just worked hard and kept my head down, eventually I could become an AC2, which was a shift supervisor. And within a few more years of diligent effort, if I really worked hard, I could become an AC3, which was a unit manager. And, I'm from a working class family, and making my family proud was mostly contingent on my ability to keep a steady job. Like that was always in the fine print of proud parents, was that you had a steady job and you went to work every day. And this was my first real opportunity to do just that. I'd started dating a girl that was friends with my old ex-girlfriend Lauren from way back when we were in high school. Her name was Caitlin, and she had just moved back to town after an unsuccessful 3 years at college. Her parents were just recently divorced, and she had simultaneously had broken up with her high school boyfriend at the time. And I think I just happened to be around when all of these events aligned. And we just kind of fell in quickly with one another, and we're living together rather fast in a nice 3-bedroom apartment in Lakeland Hills above Auburn. We had a few roommates, and so things were still pretty chaotic. We would throw house parties from time to time, which occasionally ended in fist fights out in the parking lot. But for the most part, we were trying to be responsible adults. My job didn't pay particularly well, and I was always on the knife's edge of missing a bill or falling behind on a car payment. But we were surviving the best we could, and my job was steady enough. By about November of that year, Caitlin announced to me that she was pregnant. And I think I threw a small pity party for myself at that point. I was 20 years old and still only had my GED. And while my job paid enough to support me alone, it was a far cry to believe that I would be able to pay for a child or support a family without making significant lifestyle changes. I had big dreams of traveling the world and learning more languages and living in other countries, living wildly. And so I was sort of a baby about it when I found out, pun intended. I did some moping around for about a day or two, but still reassured Caitlin that I was going to support her and meet any of her needs and be there to raise our child. I proposed, probably a month or two later after some urging from Caitlin. I didn't have any money for a ring, but Caitlin's mom offered to give me her old engagement ring, and so I planned a proposal based on that. And I did it in our apartment bedroom with some flowers and sweet words, and She said yes, of course. I don't think I was prepared to get married, though, at that time, or even necessarily really wanted to. But it just seemed like the right thing to do, given the circumstances I was dealing with at the moment. Caitlin was happy to be, engaged and have a wedding to plan for and a baby on the horizon. And she really seemed pretty content with the world during that season and time of our lives. I sort of felt like I was on my way to be living the American dream. As I was working a steady job, earning about $10 an hour, I was engaged to be married, I was living on my own in my own apartment, and I had a baby on the way. I felt like I was on my way. When my son was born, it was amongst the happiest moments of my life. I got a call from the front office when I was on shift that Caitlin needed me home because her water broke, and I drove home around 3 a.m. and picked her up and took her to the hospital. And approximately 12 hours of labor later, we welcomed my son, Rylan J. McCork, into the world. And I cut his cord, and then after he spent a few moments with his mom, he was passed to me, and I just held him. And he stared up into my eyes, and everything stopped. I had created life, I had made this beautiful human who now looked upon me with tender admiration. My world would never be the same. I would never be the same. I heard someone say once that the moment you have kids is the last time you're alone in your own mind ever again. And that was certainly true for me. Everything for me from that moment on was motivated by my need to protect his life and ensure his well-being. Well, I should have known something bad was on the horizon when George W. Bush left office, because he gave this really haunting state of being about how a recession was coming.
We're in the midst of a serious financial crisis,
economic collapse,
and the federal
or something like it. I remember watching it on TV, but not really processing it until July of 2009. I was called down to the conference room at work with about 30 or 40 of my fellow employees. And we were all walking in, someone said that we might be getting pink slipped. And I remember saying to that person, they can't fire us. Who's going to take care of these patients? I said, with too much confidence, because I was wrong. They laid all of us off about 30 minutes later. State funding and resource allocation and yada, yada, yada. We were given 30 days notice. My son was about 2 weeks old at this point, and I was panicking about paying rent and my car payment and paying for diapers and food. I reassured myself that unemployment was available in the worst case scenario, but that I wouldn't need it because I would be finding a new job before benefits even had the chance to kick in. So I packed my things for the day, and I went home to tell Caitlin the hard news. Thanks for listening to Odyssey of a Teenage Dirtbag. Every episode is another piece of the story. Proof that no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back up. If this episode meant something to you, share it with someone, Like and subscribe below if you haven't already. And until next time, keep chasing the life you were meant to live. Thanks for listening.